Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and I welcome you to episode 61 of season 2, the second in my mini-series on Krishnadevaraya. In the last episode, I spoke of the significance of the year 1509 AD, not only because Krishnadeva had ascended the throne in Vijayanagara, but also because in a sense, the order of things, everything, was changing. If you haven't listened to that episode, try to give it a shot. In this episode though, I will walk you through the first years of Krishnadeva's reign and how he managed to cope in his new job and prove himself to the court. But first, a word of thanks to the Prestige Group, whose corporate support makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Let's get a sense of where I left you in the last episode. It was a moment of rupture. Across the world, the old order was breaking. The monolithic authority of the Catholic Church was being challenged by the emergence of Protestantism. Henry VIII became the King of England in the same year that Krishnadevaraya became king in Vijayanagara. And within the empire itself, there were dangers closer to home. The Deccan sultanate, specifically the Bijapur Sultanate, was watching at the border. The Gajapatis of Odisha still held vast tracts of eastern Andhra and possibly saw the ascension of Krishnadeva as an opportunity to regain some territory. And only months before he became king, the Portuguese navy had dealt a crushing blow to the cobbled together coalition of Calicut, Gujarat and Egypt at the naval battle of Diu, and Indian kings had lost control of the western seaboard. And this would have been terrible news for Vijayanagara because the western ports were a lifeline for trade, not the least because that was how the all-important horses could be imported. The belligerent Portuguese presence on Indian soil had to be handled. The stakes for Vijayanagara could not be higher. The situation called for a king who was experienced and would know precisely how to handle something like this. A strong king who could balance the twin imperatives of military strength and diplomacy. It was into this scenario that Krishnadeva, untrained in kingly duties, stepped. The nobility would have remembered the instability of the past reigns, and as the king's brother, they would have known Krishnadeva very well. And now, while they had consented to Timmarasu's idea to make Krishnadeva the king, he would have to prove himself, prove that he was up to the task. Krishnadeva was already in his late 30s, not too old to rule, but long past the age to expect the indulgence from the elders as a young kid. The crown had passed to him, trust had not. He would have to earn his stripes. Everything was on the table all at once. The sultanates in the north, the Gajapatis of Odisha, and because of the vulnerability of the fallen western ports, he needed to be able to secure the fortunes of the country, even as the Portuguese were starting to dominate several aspects of trade and politics, and Vijayanagara was sucked into a complicated and downright twisty diplomatic and commercial engagement with them. And Krishnadeva would have to prove himself on all of these fronts. This meant he needed to secure his state, and this also meant a strong military and administration to keep the revenues flowing and defend the wealth of the land against invaders. The problem was that he had no measure of where things were. Records were poorly kept by his brother Veera Narasimha and the kings before him. So the first thing Krishnadeva embarked upon, like any new CEO would do in the present day, was an audit of the kingdom. At this point, I need to explain how the kingdom was ruled in the days of Krishnadevaraya. When we think of kings and their kingdoms, we often imagine kingdoms where the ruler had ultimate authority over everything and everyone, and all power was centralized and in his sole control. In theory, yes. The reality was much more nuanced. In Vijayanagara, sovereignty was exercised through delegation. Divisions of the land, much like districts, were granted to people to administer. These people were variously called Nayaka, Palegar, Gauda and other titles depending on the circumstances. Many styled themselves as Raja. Not to confuse this with vassal states or kingdoms, these provincial chieftains were given the right to rule their provinces not as independent kingdoms but as semi-autonomous vassals. In 1956, historian Aidan Southall, writing about the Ala region of Uganda, described this method of delegated royal powers as the segmentary state. Years later, Burton Stein used this phrase to describe the Vijayanagara administration. Segmentary state simply means the rule of the land, revenue and defense was effected through a web of regional chiefs or nayakas, each ruling their domain with partial autonomy, each being granted the right to collect taxes and to administer justice. But in return, they were all required to maintain a standing army that would be provided to the emperor on demand. And the kingdom provided financial support for the maintenance of these standing armies of the nayakas. Together with the army of the kingdom, it would be a formidable force spread out tactically across every domain of the empire. Again, in theory, this was a noble scheme of things. On the ground, of course, it only could have been an uneasy balance, leaving so much military power in the hands of feudal lords. The history of Karnataka has shown that feudal lords could never be trusted not to have their own ambition, and indeed, almost every dynasty that succeeded to the throne, from the Chalukyas to the Rashtrakutas to the Kalyani Chalukyas to the Hoysalas, were all feudal lords who rose successfully against the empire. One morning, early in his reign, Krishnadeva was seated at court contemplating verses on royal conduct, stanzas being recited in Telugu by a scholar from the Rayalaseema region. It was a poem by Badena Bhupati, and one stanza in particular struck a chord. A king must have an army greater than those of his lords, only then will he grow strong and deploy his forces far and wide. Krishnadeva would have sat bolt upright at this. And then came the sting. The poet went on to praise the great private armies of the nayakas, extolling their strength, their horses, their command of men. Was this Badena sending a subtle message to the king? If Krishnadeva did not react on the spot, evidence is that he was disturbed. Later that week, he quietly asked for a full review of military finances. What came back startled him. First, the chief of the treasury, Allallanatha, said to him that they did not have any real accounting because, he said, Veera Narasimha had not asked to see the accounts ever. When Krishnadeva ordered him to do so, he and the accountant set out preparing the audit for the king, and it is said that they worked day and night. The results came in. Allallanatha reported, "By my calculations, the Nayaka estates ought to provide the king a standing army of 24,000 horses, 1,200 elephants, and 200,000 infantry men. But the Nayakas have continually failed to provide the correct number of horses, elephant, and infantry. This disparity is certainly worthy of your Majesty's consideration." The poet Badena was right. The combined armies of the Nayakas outmatched the entire army of Krishnadevaraya, the central army. What made it worse was that he was subsidizing all of this. And then the added realization that the Nayakas had been helping themselves to these royal funds, their fingers in the till. So Krishnadeva turned to the one man he trusted without hesitation, his minister, the prime minister and mentor, Timmarasu, the one who had kept him from getting blinded, the one who had elevated him to the throne. He laid out the numbers, the evidence of the Nayakas fiddling with funds, but more importantly, the small size of the Vijayanagara army compared to the combined forces of the Nayakas was the greater threat. This imbalance needed to be corrected while it still could, before it was too late. Embarking on a show of force against the Nayakas was no solution. It would be ill-advised and a downright dangerous move. There had to be a better way to do this. Timmarasu listened and said, "Leave it to me." What happened next was a quiet and effective handling of the situation, an example in all of Vijayanagara history. The accounts of how exactly it transpired vary, but in effect, Timmarasu summoned the Nayakas to the court on the pretext of the king needing their presence. He asked them to bring their core military forces. When all the feudal lords had assumed, Timmarasa laid out the evidence, the misuse of grants, the excessive levies, the sheer imbalance of power. And then he gave them a choice. Relinquish your private armies, he said. Let the emperor create a new central force, professional, disciplined, loyal to the throne. Or face a public audit, a reckoning of your accounts in open court to the public. Shamed and remorseful, the lords gave in. They surrendered one by one. Not a sword had to be drawn. The nayakas pledged 500 elephants, 12,000 horses, and 100,000 infantry, all from their own armies. And just like that, the wise old Timmarasu had done what few thought possible. He built the Vijayanagara army in a single day. And when Krishnadeva returned to the capital, he returned to something new, a standing army, royal in command, imperial in size. The balance of power had been shifted. Krishnadevaraya was astonished. He looked at Timmarasu and said, "Who else but you could make this impossible happen?" In recognition, not the least in gratitude, he ordered Timmarasu be honored with the traditional 7 gifts, a ceremonial cap, an ornate shirt, a necklace, pearl earrings, a yellow shawl, a fragrant musk, and a fresh betel leaf. Then, smiling, he declared, "Today my kingship has finally found its footing." Having said that, he climbed on top of his elephant, one named Masti Madahasti, into the golden howdah, and then in a gesture that would be remembered for years, he turned and invited Timmarasu to take the seat behind him. And so the king and minister rode together right through the streets of the capital with a mighty new army following in their wake. This close relationship was most unusual. And as we will see in the episodes to follow, Timmarasu was held in such high estimation that he started to appear on inscriptions, even on other state-issued objects like coins. But for now, the empire had shown spine, and Krishnadevaraya could turn his attention to his enemies. And now for a well-deserved commercial break. When I come back, Krishnadeva flexes his muscles right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Sitting on the back of the elephant in procession with Timmarasu behind him, Krishnadeva must have taken stock. By making the feudal vassals surrender their army and making sure about the administrative and fiscal accountability from the Panjandrams, he had taken control of his military and the administration of the state. The expansion of the army came at a fortuitous time for Krishnadeva. An easily irritable man by nature, as some records did suggest, he saw military action as much as an option as he would consider diplomacy. Now, speaking of his character and habits, there are only 2 accounts that we can really rely on. One from the Persian historian Firishta and the other from the Portuguese chronicler Domingo Pais. For all the tales of glory of Krishnadeva that have been told, there is a quirk of history where we might have wound up with the opposite measure of the man. Firishta, for example, didn't even name Krishnadeva when he wrote about that period. Because of that silence, and because so many imperial inscriptions only describe the king's conquest without mentioning his actions, it led some historians to wonder, was Krishnadeva truly ruling? Or was he just a ceremonial figure, a puppet in the hands of his minister, or maybe even a king in name alone? Now that doubt would have lingered in history if not for Domingo Pais. Domingo Pais visited Vijayanagara around 1520. He met Krishnadevaraya in person, and his account makes one thing absolutely clear. Krishnadevaraya ruled. He was not only monarch by law, but a sovereign in the fullest sense, commanding vast power with a strong presence and complete authority. Pais describes him as physically powerful, someone who kept himself fit with the sword practice and clubs training. He was a skilled rider. He woke early, and when he walked into court, people noticed him. And yet, for all that strength, he was also generous, thoughtful, and gracious. A king who ruled firmly but was loved as much as he was feared. There was no shadow government, no secret puppeteer behind the curtain. It was Krishnadeva who was holding the reins. All of these glowing descriptions, these encomiums, were all from the pen of Domingo Paez, who called him gallant and perfect. Judging by all the events of his reign, it was very clear that Krishnadeva did not enjoy quietude. It seemed that he did not care much for a retiring life, despite his cultural leanings. He rose to every challenge with as much belligerence as was needed, and several of his military campaigns speak to that. Now, all this started early in his reign. It has long been the practice of empires that when a new king ascends the throne, he is immediately pressured by his enemies, even attacked on occasion. A similar occasion marked the very beginning of Krishnadeva's rule, when he was faced up with two threats, one from the Bijapur Sultanate and the other an uprising in Umattur. The Bijapur Sultanate was one of 5 sultanates that had broken off from the now splintered Bahmani Sultanate in the wake of a weakening Delhi. While in later years the Bijapur Sultanate would be the nemesis of Vijayanagara, the incursions made into Vijayanagara during Krishnadevaraya's time was almost like they were testing the waters with the new king. The geographical significance of Bijapur was that it shared a southern border with Vijayanagara. Now, history has labeled the Bijapur incursions as border skirmishes, and maybe they were, but Krishnadeva responded with force. Tensions along the western frontier had been simmering since before his coronation. That sultan had long eyed the Raichur Doab, a stretch of fertile land between the Krishna and the Tungabhadra, and they had tested boundaries over and over, much more than once. And now, emboldened by the fall of Calicut in the west, they decided to move again. But rather than wait, Krishnadeva pushed first. He led a preemptive strike against Bijapur, not to conquer, but to warn them. His troops struck hard at the frontier, tested their strength, and then pulled back. There was no full-scale war, to be fair, not yet. But the message was unmistakable. He would not respond well to threats, and he had no trouble returning fire. The other threat around the initial years of Krishnadeva's reign came from an old rebel province, Umattur, a province near Mysore with its stronghold at Srirangapatna fort, all of which later passed to the Wadiyars. Umattur had been a thorn in the side of the empire for decades. Previously, they had faced down Krishnadeva's predecessor Veera Narasimha. The problem was an assertion of independence. To the assembled armies of Veera Narasimha, the Appan, the Raja of Umattur, had sent word as follows, and I quote, "We have been protecting this kingdom in this country for a long time. Neither the members of our dynasty nor the Kongala Rajas who had ruled these lands for generations ever paid tribute to any king. But then your father, Raya, conquered us by his might and exacted tribute. Legally there is no justice in our paying tribute to you, and so we will not send it." This had not gone well for Umattur at that time. And now many years later, with the younger brother Krishnadeva in place, Umattur acted up again. And this time they acted upon their bravado and captured the Penukonda fort, the place where Saluva Narasimha had gone to die. Krishnadeva saw this attack on a key Vijayanagara position as intolerable. He took a strike force of only 5,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry and marched on Penukonda. According to the chronicles, the king's men surrounded and suffocated the fort and took it in a single day. The walls were razed to the ground. Officers loyal to the crown were left in charge. From there, Krishnadeva turned his attention to a far more daunting prize, the island fortress at Shivasamudram. Perched in the middle of the Kaveri, it was ruled by the Gangaraja, a rebel chieftain with a long-standing grudge against the empire. Shivasamudram was not easy to reach, leave alone to conquer. So Krishnadeva dug in, settled for the long game. His army encamped along the riverbanks and, as local accounts record, blockaded every approach to the fort by water and by land. The siege dragged on for over a year, And finally, when the end came, it came with force. The court poet Timmarasu would later write that the walls of Shivasamudram collapsed into the red waters of the Kaveri, waters that had turned red with battle. Seeing no way out, the Gangaraja is said to have drowned himself in the very river that had shielded him for so long. From there, Krishnadeva then marched on Srirangapatna, another similar river island fortress, and another node in the rebel alliance. But this time there was no fight. The town yielded, the fort opened the gates, and the king, after inspecting the bastions, entered the temple of Adi Ranganayaka and offered worship to the god. Krishnadeva then placed control of these reclaimed forts in the hands of his trusted Telugu commanders because they had proven their loyalty over and over again. And in an empire as vast and as easily brittle as Vijayanagara, loyalty meant everything. This was Krishnadeva's first military test as emperor, and he passed it with speed and resolve. The Umattur campaigns also sent a chilling message across the provinces. This was a king who could not be messed with, and with that, Vijayanagara had shown a spine, one that in the hands of Krishnadeva was ready to face any challenge. Coming up in the next episode, Krishnadeva's act of diplomacy with the Portuguese, his softer and more literary side, and of course, his campaign moves east, a move that one day gave him the entire southern peninsular India. All that is coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.